It's more than a survival activity. It's a time for sharing, making friends, relaxing. The average human will spend about 3.66 years of their life eating. Given the average lifespan of 75 years, this is not a considerable amount of time. It almost makes sense how little thought we put into where our food comes from. Food is biological matter, and a main input to the growth of this matter is water. Oysters are filter-feeding mollusks, meaning they feed from absorbing the water around them through their gills. An oyster's natural cycle of nutrient consumption has the power to rebalance water in the shallow waters they usually inhabit. As such, oysters have great influence on the water quality of their ecosystem. The water quality will determine the type of underwater grasses that will grow in the ecosystem and, subsequently, impact the type of species in the habitat and the landscape of the surrounding area. Because the oyster's filtering plays a crucial role in this habitat structuring and food web dynamics, they have earned the title of ecosystem engineers.
They tend to make a comparison like fine wine, like the terroir, like if you like French wine, the land puts its flavor into the grape. They tend to approach that the same way. The ocean where they're in, the area of the water, gives the character to the oyster.
You don't feed an oyster. It's a filtration. They have their own filtration system, and they filter out the plankton. You have to look at oyster like you would look at a wine grape. Let's say if you buy a Chardonnay, you have a Chardonnay grape from France, and then you go to Sonoma, or you go to Chile, or you go anywhere in the world, you have the same exact grape, or will taste so different. And this is the same thing. I would say November, December, they're delicious. This is the best. This is the peak time for taste.
We only have one species of oyster in New England, but the abundance and the distribution of oysters has changed in the harbor. If you talk to anybody that eats a lot of oysters, they'll say Wellfleets are among the best tasting oysters. And that has a lot to do with what the oysters are eating. So it has to do with the phytoplankton in the water. I think they're really good. I've had other oysters that they almost taste less. I like oysters from cold water. I don't eat oysters in the summer. I just know a good oyster when I taste one, and the ones from Wellfleet are really good, and the clams too. We like the clams. This is an oyster shack, and you can see how they were lined up at the pier, and you'd pull in your boat and offload your oysters, and then they could be shucked and put in barrels or somehow bagged and put up. The railroad was right near here, and they were sent to Boston. Historically, Wellfleet our harbor was loaded with oysters. In the 1600s, Samuel de Champlain sailed into the harbor, and there were so many oyster reefs that he said they were navigation hazards. So loaded with oysters, and people would harvest them. But sometime a couple hundred years later, either because of overharvest and or some kind of disease, there were very few oysters in Wellfleet Harbor. In the 40 years that I've been non-commercially shell fishing, we've seen a lot of changes. There seem to be fewer oysters and clams overall in the harbor. So most of the economics, most of the industry has shifted over to aquaculture or farming oysters and clams rather than relying on what's naturally in the wild. What Wellfleet likes to say about our oysters here is that they're organic and it's sustainable because we keep growing them. We're not, in the shellfish aquaculture, you're not taking them from the wild. So that's sustainable.
Oysters for aquaculture first starts with adult oysters spawning. The male and female oysters release their reproductive cells into the water. A key signal for them to do this at the same time is the water temperature. Spawning occurs whenever the water exceeds 68 degrees Fahrenheit. If the fertilization happens, the egg and sperm join to form a larvae.
Larvae.
Larvae, yes, the eggs that are turning into larvae, and the larvae have to attach to something with calcium on it.
All the racks you see right now pretty much have our seed on it. 90% of our seed comes from hat seed. We have these, they're plastic discs and they come on a stick and there's 42 of them. We dip them in a mixture of lime, sand, and cement. And then we stick them out here in July, and then by August it looks like pepper is thrown on them. It's like little itty bitty specks.
But this would be a little oyster spat here. So this farmer out here has these cement structures and he catches all these. So, and then scrapes them off and puts them in a bag. So they have these racks generally made with rebar. And then they have oysters in bags tied to the racks. And you start the oysters out at a certain density in bags that have very small mesh size. But then as the oysters grow, they need more room and they need bigger holes in the mesh to get more food. So you have to keep working them. And you can't just put them there and wait for them to grow to legal size. So you really have to work hard at culling them, separating them according to size, moving them into bigger bags so they have more space.
So we get the seeds from the hat. We overwinter them. Either we take the shellfish in grow bags and put the seed in it and staple them to the bottom to prevent them from ice, or we put them in a walk-in or a pit, take them out, bag them up, put them on the racks as you see here, let them grow, and then you go through them. We have a machine that sizes them. So you go through them and then you take the different sizes. Some of them might be ready to sell, so you sell those. The others either you plant on the bottom or put back in a bag and then rake them up and go through them again until the crop's gone. And then at the same time that you have the older crop that you're still going through, a new crop will come through.
Last year we had on the payroll up to 16 people.
Wow.
Which I want to say 90% of them from Wellfleet.
Yeah,
But we employ steadily between 12 and 8.
That's
8
great.
people, you know, and a lot of young people like Jake's age and stuff, you know.
7 days a week.
And
why do you
sometimes
call
twice a day.
and my brother says to me, when you got to retire? I says, from what? I never worked a day in my life. I never call this work. And I hope Jake feels that way too.
Most of the
It's-
time.
most of the time.
No, I do. No, I love it.
In order to be a successful oyster farmer, you really have to know what you're doing.
Tide's coming in, and so we just brought in everything that we caught today. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take it back and we're going to grade it, sort it by size. and then we'll bring it back out, and then we'll place it in the right compartments it needs to be. Well, this is we have a trademark name, and we sell puffer petites. And puffer petites are just a little under 3 inches. They're like 2 3/4. The oysters we have free range, kind of like a free range chicken. We let them free range a little bit, so they're scooping them up. Those guys, if you had an oyster per se, it lived in a river and was in the water all the time. The river never went dry. The oyster would just feed. So you went to ship it, it wouldn't close up. It would be open and it would lose its liqueur. So they would either have to pack them really tight, or some people thought of putting rubber bands around them. But with the well fleets, what makes them unique is they know when there's no water, it's time to close up tight. And they hold all their valuable liquor, which really gives them that unique flavor inside this beautiful oyster.
We're not seeing that yet. Our water, where all of the growing is happening, is not acidic yet. I think they were having some problems on the West Coast, and it wasn't so much the adult oysters, but the seed oysters that they're trying to grow in the nurseries to give to the shell fishermen. So I'm concerned about that, because if you're relying only on nurseries to supply your shellfish, and then you have something happen like the waters get warmer, your oysters might not be able to adapt to that.
Yeah, it's a really sustainable process, and we think it's really cool not having to rely on a hatchery as much. With the changing conditions in the water, we hope we can continue that, but there's definitely, problems if the ocean becomes more acidic that we could face.
The world's oceans act as natural reservoirs for excess atmospheric carbon dioxide, absorbing about 26%, or 22 million tons, of the human-generated greenhouse gas emissions each day. Rapidly increasing amounts of CO2 mixed with seawater forms carbonic acid, which leads to a decrease in the pH of ocean water.
One funny thing is that there was a period of time, a couple years back, where the hatcheries couldn't get the oysters to live beyond about 6 years. So, and one of the things they thought about was ocean acidity, and they started one of their first responses was to just buffer the water with lime. You know what I mean? Just to change the pH.
Ocean acidification affects oysters because the oyster's outer shell is made of limestone, an alkaline substance prone to dissolving in acidic conditions. During development, larval shells do not contain as much calcium carbonate as adult oysters, and as such much more prone to dissolving in acid.
Yeah, go ahead.
But other places in the harbor, they're coming up with all of a sudden this, the shells aren't calcifying, so they're really brittle. And this is like a freak phenomena that's happening in the South Wellfleet area. And I've seen it. And you literally could take it, it's like an eggshell. You could take the oysters and just squeeze them. There's no resistance. It's like, and it's something new that we've never dealt with before, But I just want to add to the ocean acidity. When we have a larvae and it sets, it has an embryo or an egg sac that they live off of. And that's supposed to keep them alive for like 14 days. And what it does, it enables them to swim, and then they attach themselves and form a shell, and then they can start feeding on their own. Well, in hatcheries and everything that I've read, and even in our own hatchery, ARC, they've had problems with the acidity of the water level. It's too acidic, and it eats at the embryo. So Dick Krause, and he's the president of ARC, I'm sure some of you guys have heard his name, has told me that he can't keep the larvae alive more than 4 or 5 days. And then and the embryo is completely gone. So, well, it's JOD, which is juvenile oyster disease, and it's wiping out Long Island, New York as we speak. Now they renamed it, it's called ROD, and it's an offspring of this same kind of virus that's wiping these oysters out in a small hatchery stage, And if we bring that into our harbor, we're going to be starting all over again from ground zero. You know, I'll be honest with you. I always thought clams were bulletproof, and then one day, you know, we got something foreign in the water, and it really is a struggle to keep growing them. We're at the point, we're right on that line whether it's worth it or not, you know.
They have preferences. Now, oysters are more generalized feeders than our clams. And in addition, oysters do more sort of detritus feeding. You know what I mean? So sort of the classic example of that was there's an algae bloom, and the algae dies and it goes down to the bottom and mixes with the substrate. So there's within the substrate there's dead algae and such that they can eat. For example, shellfish, you know, the main pathogen that the state tests for is fecal coliform, but shellfish love it.
And last year I saw something. I've been doing this for 40 plus years, and I saw something in the harbor in the water column I never saw in my life before. These puffballs of algae coming through like balloons. They look like balloons.
It's from Japan also. It begins with a J. It came in here.
Oh, they could be big.
They're kind of pretty. They come in, but then they build up, and it smells really bad. And a lot of coastal communities have been having problems with it.
You can't grab it. It's kind of like, it's almost like a jellyfish, you know?
Yeah.
It goes through your hands. You can't grab the mass of it, but yet it lays down like a mat, you know?
It's definitely a challenge,
But
yeah.
that's the life of, I mean, it's not always like,
yeah,
oh
not to
my
be,
God, you know?
we don't want to be too doom and gloom, and we definitely have a good...
We keep trying. We get up every day, you know? But this new stuff, and Jake knows what it is, I just saw it last year, and I'm telling you, I'm terrified of it. I don't know if it's coming back next year. I mean, to me, that's going to be the worst thing of anything that we've ever faced.
If there's a lot of nitrogen, if the town's putting out a lot of nitrogen in the harbor, it's obviously going to stimulate this. So that's why it's so important to try to control that the best we can.
Well, I think the first big set is a little delayed from what I remember historically, but I don't know how crazy I am. I mean, I think I remember when I was a kid and such, I think I remember, you know, warmer springs and colder fall, but I could be nuts. You know, I mean, I don't.
No, I think you're right.
And then climate change is another thing. Just recently, there seems to be a real trend that we have later starting winters and later starting springs. This year, this area was scheduled to open up March 15th. It was freezing. It was awful. Okay, but we're used to it. You know.
You think about the water quality. For example, you wouldn't have an oyster farm right here with all the boats and gasoline and that kind of thing is. So you pick a spot depending on the water quality and the access to it, because you have to get to it. Whether you drive a truck or take a boat. Most of the shellfish farms in Wellfleet are ones that you can get to at low tide. So you want to have an accessible site as well. You'll see a truck where that boat is. You know, you'll see the trucks out there because they're out on the flats. In some areas of Wellfleet, there's just a little strip of sand that they can drive on. Now, should the water levels rise, that might be gone. So they'll have to have other ways to get to their, we call them grants. We have sea level rise, they may not have access to their growing areas the way they do. That if the waters warm up, we're going to see more diseases like Vibrio and others that typically aren't seen here because some of these diseases tend to be seen in warmer temperature zones. I was part of a working group called Climate Change and Shellfish in Wellfleet, and we met for a couple of years and we produced a number of documents and also a website that can be used for a resource. All of those things should be a heads up to the industry that things will not continue like this indefinitely, that people who rely on shellfish, like that truck C&R shellfish, they should be thinking ahead and have some contingency plans.
But I made sure Jake had a good education before he signed on. You know, like a plan B, you know what I mean?
Oh, definitely, yeah. You never know what's going to happen in oyster die-offs, and you know, you see what happened with the clams. If that happened with the oysters, we'd definitely be having a tough time. But you know, you just try to keep the water as clean as you can and hope for the best.
A lot of what the state has done is to impose regulations, in particular against a disease called Vibrio. It's a bacterial disease that can get people sick. We know that Vibrio grows well in warmer temperatures. So now we have a lot of regulations regarding harvesting in the summer, where you have to ice your oysters immediately. You can't just like leave them out in a bucket in your truck overnight. So we have a lot of regulations in place to protect the public against things that we know about, like Vibrio. Walking dogs near shellfish growing areas, we've had a lot of issues with that, and the town has tried to do a lot of education around that. Pick up after your dog. There are certain places where dogs are allowed on the beach, and it's very confusing in Wellfleet because the National Seashore has a certain set of rules, the town has another set of rules. But in shellfish growing areas, near shellfish growing areas, generally dogs are not permitted. We don't have a central sewage treatment plant. Most of the facilities, even the restaurants here, have septic tanks or cesspools or some kind of a septic treatment on site. So there's always the problem of a possibility of something happening that will contaminate the harbor. In the summer, this place is loaded with boats. They're not supposed to dump in the harbor, but somebody's not obeying the regulations and pumping out at a pump out station, that could introduce contaminants into the water. So it's a pretty fragile environment. So I think it's important that things are carefully monitored so that there is no impact on human health. Farmed oysters are perfectly fine. They are not on the list from the Monterey Bay Aquarium as far as being some kind of fish that you should avoid, if they're safe, depending on how you like them. So in some places people just cook them and make soups and stews. Wellfleet oysters tend to be used for raw bars, for raw consumption, which poses some other issues that have nothing to do with sustainability, but other issues that have to be carefully monitored in terms of the public health perspective, because it's raw food. Now, other diseases we don't know about and they're not being monitored, like the sporadic norovirus that happened last time. I still don't think anyone knows what the real source of that was, which is kind of troubling because you can't prevent it if you don't know where it's coming from.
If we think of this system as a food chain, we, the consumer, are the last step. Obviously, the aquaculture industry faces many challenges out in the field, but as consumers, what can we do to help the industry? Could oysters really be the food of the future? We often don't think of where our food comes from. In the case of oysters and most aquaculture, it is a form of agriculture. It is not abundant and we must eat responsibly. As informed consumers, it is our responsibility to find out where our food comes from. To be safe, it's better to consume farmed oysters. And of course, take care of the water and the oceans. Most sewage drains into and pollutes the oceans. Try to minimize the waste that is thrown into water. Similarly, keep the streets clean. Rain runoffs also go into the ocean, making the wildlife sick with diseases such as Vibrio. After all, water is everywhere, and everything is made of water.
So like when you talk to like real like oyster people, they make like a wine and all. No, I'm just a guy who likes to eat.